Hello everyone. Welcome to another Worm Farm Q&A live on White David Gardening and Worm Farm. So today we're going to be discussing some worm farming questions as usual. Hi Sian. Hi everyone. Hi Han White. Hi Russell. How are you guys doing? Okay, so this week we're going to be asking some more questions regarding worm farming. And my first question is how many eggs are in a worm cocoon? What do you think? Do you know that a worm cocoon has up to 20 eggs in it? So that little yellow ball that we see and we call that the worm egg, it is actually the worm cocoon and it has up to 20 eggs in there. Now, how long does it take for worm eggs to incubate? Tons. And White says there are tons of. Okay. Yes, there are actually 20 eggs in. Oh, hi, Rodney. Thank you all for joining me today. So, the second question that I ask is how long does it take for worm eggs to incubate? It depends on the species. Yes, that is true as well. I mostly focus on red wigglers since as those are the majority of the worms that I raise. Right. And usually red wigglers, if the worms reproduce at a slower rate, then they're going to have more cocoons or more eggs than worms that reproduce regularly, because you know how in nature things that are what would you say now that are more likely to be threatened will reproduce faster than those that are always in abundance. So for example, fish, when they lay their eggs, the fish usually lay hundreds and thousands of eggs because the possibility of all of them hatching is very low. So in order to ensure that there is enough to continue the population, they lay a lot of eggs. So I guess in a similar sense it is with the worms. Some will produce far more eggs than others. Okay, so it takes roughly 3 weeks for worm eggs to hatch. Now, what is the average amount of worms that hatch from a cocoon? So we said that a cocoon has up to 20 eggs in it. What is the average amount of worms that will hatch from the entire cocoon with 20 eggs? Yes, only 3 weeks. That's all it takes for the worm eggs to hatch. Of course, if condition is not ideal in the bin, 5. It's a good answer. Um, yeah, so if the condition is not ideal in the bin, even though it can take up to 3 weeks for the cocoons to hatch, or the eggs to hatch, if condition is not good, then what you're going to find happening is that the eggs will stay dormant until condition improves in the bin. And the egg can stay up to 3 years without hatching until at least the basic condition is met. I had to call Uncle Jim's today. Worms were sent Thursday afternoon during a freezing period. What does freezing condition have on worms? Okay, interesting question. Worms don't do well in freezing condition, they will die. Usually for your worms to survive freezing temperatures, they would have to bury themselves below your frost line. So if they are in a small container, then the chances of them freezing is very high unless the container that they are in is in an environment that is not frozen, then your worms will survive. But if they get exposed for any extended period of time, then they definitely will freeze. So I hope that goes well for you. I hope your worms arrive safe. Can be so tricky sending worm at this time of year because we don't really know what type of handling they go through when you ship them from you, unless you specify on the package that, okay, this package require warmth, and I guess that would cost you a bit more. The worms arrived, not moving, showed no sign of life. Oh, okay. So, are they alive? Are they alive now? They were very understanding and are sending more. Nice, nice. So, what did you do with those worms, the ones that weren't showing any signs of life? Did you put them a while and see if maybe they are still alive, or did you get rid of them? Hopefully, they are still alive. Okay, so yes, I keep them in the container. Okay, and hopefully the container is in a nice warm environment where they can warm up a bit in case they some or all of them survived. Okay, so yes, we were going to answer the question about how much worms will hatch from a cocoon in the worm bin. Okay, that's good. An average of 2 to 4 will hatch from the entire cocoon of 20 eggs. I have found the bigger breeders are, the bigger the cocoons are, and the bigger the cocoons, the more hatchlings to emerge from a cocoon. Nice. Yes, that is true, even with the same species of worm. So, say for example, you have red wigglers and they lay their eggs. If you have the adults that are really mature, like they've been mature for a period of time, maybe a year or more, then these ones will actually lay larger eggs. If the red wigglers are mature or adults, but they are young adults, their eggs, their cocoons tend to be smaller and you will get less worm from it. If the species of different species of worms, because of their size, their cocoon is going to be bigger. So the Nightcrawlers cocoon will be a lot bigger than the red wiggler cocoon. And let's see. Yes, and not only that, the more mature worms tend to lay more eggs than the younger adult worms. So the older your worms are, of course, when they get to a certain point, then they're going to slow down. But the more mature they are, then the more eggs they will lay too. Now, how long does it take for worms, red wigglers, to reach maturity? This question I cannot answer regarding any other species of worm except for the red wigglers because I don't know how long it takes for the other worms to reach maturity because I've never observed my Canadian nightcrawlers long enough to figure that out. I've never done any experiment with them to figure that out. Neither have I done research. Neither my European nightcrawlers, I don't have them long enough to figure that out yet either. So I can't answer for that. But for the red wrigglers, how long does it take for them to reach maturity? It takes up to 6 weeks for them to reach maturity. Of course, it can take 6 weeks, it can take up to 3 months. It depends because I don't know if because worms can be endangered, so because of that, they are built where they can control a certain aspect of their growth. Very interesting, but they can determine, okay, my population is high, I'm going to lay more eggs. My population is low, sorry, my population is high, I'm going to lay less eggs because maybe they're in confined conditions where they don't have space or food. Or they can say, okay, my population is low, so let's lay some more eggs. But it is interesting the level of control that they have over their growth, their overall well-being. It is interesting. It would be nice if I could become a worm doctor and study and learn a lot about them because they're just little interesting creatures. Okay, so for those of you who do worm farming, how do you separate your worms from castings? What method do you use? Rodney, do you worm farm? I'm just going through the list here and making sure I'm not missing anyone or any questions. Starting yesterday, yes. Oh, nice. Cool. Okay. So, how do you separate your worms from castings? There are many different methods that you can use to separate, well, quite a few, not many methods that you can use. I lined the containers with quarter-inch mesh on the bottom. Okay, cool. So, one of the methods that you can use to separate your worms is using light. So, as you know, worms do not like light. If they are exposed to the light for an hour, it will actually paralyze them. And so, if you shine light on the bin, then they will always tend to move down, trying to get away from the light. Not only does it paralyze them, but if the light produces any form of heat and it is too close to them, then it can also dehydrate them, and you know that they need moisture in order to breathe. Um, that depends. Uh, will that help to separate them? That depends on what feeding method you use. Because you said you have quarter-inch mesh on the bottom. Does the bottom of your bin has holes? And when you say on the bottom, is the mesh resting directly on the bottom of the bin? Because if the mesh is resting directly on the bottom of the bin, then I don't see how that is going to help with separating the worms from the castings. If you have mesh partway, say halfway up the bin, and I think you'd have to put that mesh in and take it out from time to time. Because so if you have castings on the bottom of your bin and you have your mesh on top of your castings, and then you put food scraps on top of that, then I can see how that will work. But if it is not resting directly, okay, so as long as you have the castings at the bottom of the bin and you have the mesh and then you have food scraps on the top, then the worms will leave the castings once they're finished with it and move up to the fresh food that you've just put in. So that method will work. But if it is just resting on the bottom of the bin, then no, that method won't work. You can use the, so as I was saying, you can use the light to separate the worms because as they move down, you just take off the material off the top. Of course, all the worms won't move down. You will always have a few, no matter what method of separation you use. You will still have a few worms remaining, but at least most of the worms over a period of time will move away from the light. Let's see, I measured and framed a screen and put it on the bottom. So like 3 inches between. Okay. So where do you put your food scraps now? Do you put it below the screen? Oh, hi garden lady. How is your day going so far? Yeah, so Rodney, where do you put your food scraps when you put the mesh in there? Do you put the food scraps on the bottom or do you put it on top of the mesh? I put it above the screen. So where are your worms? Because you said you just started the bin yesterday, right? Just got home from work. Oh, okay. I'm glad you were able to join us even though you must be tired coming in from work. Yeah, so where are your worms? Are they on below the screen? Because if they are below the screen, then they will move upwards, yes. So they will go through the screen to the food scraps. But are you open to do a flow through system? Is that what you are aiming at building here by putting the mesh there? So you're hoping that maybe the castings will fall through the mesh to the bottom of the bin? Because it sounds as if that's what you're aiming at, right? Like a few inches below the dirt right now, but yes, no action. I don't have live worms yet. Okay, okay, okay. Yes, so light you can use to separate them. You can use horizontal migration. So in your bin, yes, I would like for casting to fall through the mesh. Okay. Uh, your bottom of your bin, what is it like? Because the reason I'm asking, your bin is going to be moist, right? If your bin is moist, it means that your castings is going to be in one. It's not going to be loose. So it's going to be a bit tricky for the material to fall to the bottom of the bin, for the castings to fall to the bottom of the bin, unless you control the moisture level in the bin to the extent where the casting is damp but not wet. If it is damp and not wet, then it will work to an extent, but you might have your screen, the size of your screen, a bit concerned about in terms of these casting particles falling downwards, because if it's only 1/4 inch and it gets damp, and you know the castings tend to, even after it has dried out to a little bit, it still tends to want to stay together until you touch it, then it crumbles. So how do you get the particles to separate to fall through? Because usually you'd have to have you do a flow through system where the material, the worms just compose the material and then you can go in from the bottom and take out the castings. But with the method that you're using, I don't really know what your bin looks like, but with the method that you're using, will you have to take out the mesh with the worm and the food casting and then go into the bin and harvest the castings? Should I cut it off? Cut off what? The bottom of your worm bin? If you're going for a flow through system, then you can cut off the bottom of your worm bin and then let that 1/4 inch mesh, excuse me, let that 1/4 inch mesh remains there. And but then you might still, I don't know, I really don't know what the 1/4 inch mesh is going to do for you in terms of getting to harvest the castings from the bottom, even if you cut the bottom of the bin off, because it is such a small space for the castings to fall through if the casting is not dry enough. But then I don't really know what your worm bin look like. Right. So horizontal migration is another method that you can use to harvest your worms. So say you have a good amount of casting in there that you want in your bin that you want to harvest, you can just move that material to one side of your bin, and then you put food material, fresh material to the other side of your bin. Most, not all of your worms over a period of time is going to move over towards the food scraps. As they move over towards the food scraps, then you will be able to harvest the castings with just a few worms and your cocoons in them. And the next method that you can use to harvest your worm is surface feeding. So, like a similar setup to what Rodney has here, you feed a small amount of food scraps to your worms. They eat the food scraps that you feed to them. When you had more food, you had it onto the surface of the bin. So on the top of whatever material you have in your bin. So you're not going to be disturbing any of the material that they have composted already. And then these worms will move up into that food scraps. They will eat that and compost it. And then you put more food on the top again, and they will eat that and compost it. So they keep climbing upwards. So as they climb upward and you're ready to harvest the bin, if you have a setup similar to Rodney's, then you may, with the bottom access to the castings from the bottom, then you just go from the bottom and you take the worms out. If not, then you will have to just remove that top layer of food scraps with the worms in it, put it in a container, harvest your castings, and then restart the bin again. And of course, when you do this, you will need to add more bedding or new bedding to the bin as you restart it. If I don't take off the bottom, it seemed like surface feeding may be a way to go. Yes, surface feeding works pretty well, and the good thing about it is that these worms, as they migrate up towards the food, some will always stay behind because there's always small particles of food scraps left back in the castings. So these ones will stay there and they will heat. And then gradually, as they process whatever is on the bottom, then they will move upward. And the method that you were using there, Rodney, I did not put worms, sorry, I did not put a mesh in mine, but one of my totes that I started off with my worm farm with, I actually made it into a flow through system. But what I did with that is I get the tote and I get a knife and I cut long openings like 1 inch wide, sorry, a half inch wide. So for every half inch, I have half inch of solid bottom of the bin, then another half inch that is open, so the full stretch of the bin. And then I have another solid stretch, then I have another half inch that is open. So I created a flow through system. It looks more similar to a rake. And the measurement that I use it because one of those little hand rakes that you can use, I get that and I rake underneath the bottom and then the castings fall out. So you'd have to put a container underneath, and then I made a stand where I can rest the bin on so that I can have access to underneath the bottom of the bin. And then I use my little rake, my hand rake, and rake the castings out. The good thing about that is that you can take off a small amount of castings if you want, or you can take off all the castings that is there available. So you don't have to worry about how wet the content is at that point in time. So I don't know, but I'm not using that system anymore. Oh, hi, Princess. It's good that you were able to join us. Right. So based on the setup that you have there, Rodney, I would definitely go ahead with the surface feeding because it's not very difficult. It's pretty easy to do. Why did I stop using it? Uh, it's for me because I have so many worm bins. to use that method can be a bit tricky because then I'm going to have to be lifting that heavy tote all the time. And then I'm going to be lifting several of them. So I'm trying to work smart and not hard. I don't want to be doing anything that is going to put unnecessary strain on my back if I don't have to. So I've moved from using totes as worm bin to using those little cement trays. So those mixing trays, I'm using those now because they are smaller and easier for me to move around. The only negative part of that is that I have so many of them to deal with as opposed to maybe a few totes. And because they are so shallow, because they're about 7, 8 inches deep, because they are so shallow, they tend to dry out more readily. So, yeah, so that's why I stopped using them because I don't want to have to be doing a lot of lifting if I don't have to. Okay, and then this other method you can use to separate your worms, and this is a very challenging one. You can actually handpick your worms. So if your worms are fed food scraps where they clump together, then it's not too bad. But if your worms are fed compost or oats, those sort of food where all the worms won't really gather together, then you have to go in one by one and pick them out. That is a method that I used the first time I harvested worms because I just got into worm farming and the lady said, okay, 3 months time, your worm population is going to double. But when I bought the worm, I put everything in my compost bin, and my compost bin is a 4 by 4 by 4 feet. And they went through the entire bin of compost. They ate everything. So I had all of that material trying to sift out what I thought would have been 2 pounds of worms. Well, I'm glad it wasn't 2 pounds of worm because to go through that size bin trying to get out 2 pounds of worm would have been torture. Although I was enjoying it, but it would have been torture anyway. Um, but because of the rate that they reproduce, I had quite a lot, and I had to go through. Imagine going through a bin and hand picking 20 pounds of worms. That's what I had to do. But then when I realized that that is what it came down to, I started looking for options. How can I harvest the worms without doing so? So now I'm sharing these options. So you can use light, you can use horizontal migration, you can use surface feeding, you can hand pick them. I'm happy to see you too, Princess. There is one other method, but I do not like it. And I see some people use it. It is okay for us, but it's not okay for the worms. And that is where they put the material, the finished material with all the worms in a sifter and sift out the castings, and then the worms are left in the sifter. Or if the worms are not left in the sifter, depending on what type of sifter they're using, then the worms will fall out into one container, excuse me, and the castings will fall out into another container. But I think it stresses out your worms, and it might take a bit of time for them to actually settle down in the new worm bin when you do that to them. So, and then I always wonder about the possibility of them getting hurt. So I don't like that method. So if that is your only choice, then fine, but it's not a method that I would recommend. Naturally, though, as I mentioned before, worms are always going to be in your castings. It doesn't matter how good you are at separating them, you're going to have some amount of worms in your castings because one, they're going to be egg cocoons, there are going to be hatchlings, and the hatchlings are so tiny you won't be able to get everything out of your casting. So when you're sifting, you're going to have a few worms in there. Sometimes even larger ones will be in there, and you're going to have your cocoons. So you can't fully escape it, but I try to extract as many of the worms as possible before sifting the castings because, well, it can be very clean for the worms. Okay, so next question. What are some reasons why your worms will try to escape your bin? Now, there are several reasons why worms try to escape from the worm bin. And one, if your bin is overcrowded, they will try to escape. Two, if there is not enough moisture, they will try to escape. If there is not enough food, they will try to escape. If the bin is too hot or too cold, they will try to escape. If your bin is acidic, they will try to escape. If they doesn't have the proper air flow through the bin, they're going to try to escape. If your environment is noisy, they may try to escape. If you have things like vibrations and stuff going on around them frequently, they will try to escape. If temperatures change any at all, they can sense it. And sometimes you might notice your worms after rain. You start to see the worms on the side of your bin, on the top of your bin, and you might worry that condition is not right in your bin. Unless the rain is falling directly in your bin, that is not the case. But what happens is that when it rains, the worms can sense the barometric pressure. So that might cause them to want to come out. But the main reason why you see them on the sides of or the top of your bin when it rains is because when it rains, it is a bit overcast. And so this mimic more of the natural worm environment where it's a bit darker, it's not on the brighter side. So the worms start to feel comfortable than than it used to be. So they will tend to crawl out now because they're feeling more secure, like they can be in when rain falls and you see the worms trying to move about. Okay, so this question a lot of beginners will ask regarding your worms. If your bin is open all the time, what is preventing your worms from crawling out? What foods can make worm bin acidic? That's a pretty good question, Rodney. Um, Onion, any member of the citrus family, any food that is acidic in nature can make your bin acidic, but only if you have large quantities of them in your bin. So if you have a one lemon or you have a one onion in the bin, then that is not going to make your bin acidic. If you have a lot of the acidic food, then yes, it will make it acidic. Uh, see, what was the point I was going to make regarding this? Yes, so most of the time when your bin is acidic, it's not because of the food you put in there, unless you have mostly acidic food in there. But most of the time when your bin is acidic, it is because one, there is too much food in the bin and the bin is not getting enough air. So your bin become anaerobic, and as the bin becomes anaerobic, you start to smell it sour. And once you're smelling your bin sour, it means that your bin is acidic. So controlling the amount of food scraps that you feed to your worms. And if you feed your worms a lot of food scraps, because I know like my sister Ann White, when she feeds her bin, she just put her food scraps in the bin. All her food scraps go in the bin. So it's not like she's saying, okay, feed them every 5 days or every 10 days or every week. So she'll put her food scraps in the bin and just because when she started, it was just a compost bin and the worms would go in there and eat. So because it was just a compost bin, these worms get used to all that food being there. Now, let's see. Right. So the thing is though, once you have too much food in the bin, then you have to make sure that you aerate your bin. So every now and then maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, or but regularly you would go and turn over the content of your bin. And when I say turn over, I don't mean pouring it out. I just mean stir it a bit so that they can get the airflow in your bin. Because if not, your bin is going to become anaerobic and it's going to be acidic, and your worms are going to try to escape. And White says, I had that problem the other day. It was raining a lot, so my worms decided to crawl out of the bin. Okay, yeah, yes. They like the darkness. Worms don't like light. So once the environment it is damp, so they can sense that moisture in the air. It is dark because it is overcast. It's not very dark, but it is dark anyway. So they start to feel comfortable, so they will try to explore. So it's not that there is something wrong with your bin. Okay, so yes, if your bin is open all the time, what is it that prevents your worm from leaving? Because this was a question even I was concerned about when I started attempting the flow through bin, because I don't know if a lot of you are new to my channel, and so you may not have seen some of my previous videos, but my outdoor tiered worm bin, the top bin is actually ropes. That's the bottom of the bin, just ropes. Right. Let's see. Clem M. Does the worms eat breadcrumbs with yeast, salt, and sugar? Worms love bread. They love bread. So I don't know if your bread wouldn't be salty because you're not going to make salty bread to eat. And the level of salt that you have in your bread, the level of sugar that you have in the bread, it does not affect them. And the yeast, just the way how they love the bread, then I'm assuming that it does not affect them either. So yes, worms do love bread. So if you have bread, you can feed it to them. In fact, I don't know, most of you may know that I don't feed my worms food scraps, just occasionally. But once I have bread and it starts to go bad, because I know they love it so much, I always feed that to them. You're welcome, Clem. Yes. So back to the question now as to whether or not what prevents the worm from crawling out when your bin is open. If as I was saying, my tiered bin, the upper layer, the bottom of it is all ropes, just ropes, and all the ropes are like 2 inches apart because it is a flow through system. You would think that the worms would crawl out. Of course, in order to keep in the material, then I put cardboard on top of the ropes, like layers of cardboards and shredded paper, so that keeps the material and the worms in the bin. But they can easily crawl out when these material break down. What prevents them from leaving? As long as the condition in your bin is okay, they will not crawl out. Light and food. Good answer. Good answer, and why? Yes, so as long as they have sufficient oxygen, they have sufficient moisture, they have food, the temperature is good, the bin is not acidic, the worms will not leave. They have everything they need. Why leave? If you know that you're living in an environment where everything that you need is right there, would you move to an environment where you have to struggle to get the things you want? No. So it's a similar situation with the worms. They have everything they need. They will not leave your bin. You can open it. You can even pour out the content on the ground. As long as the condition is right, they're not leaving. They're going to stay where everything they need is provided. How can you tell when your worm eggs are close to hatching? Okay, so worm eggs, as you know, tend to be yellow. shortly after. Yes, right on white, they turn orange. Yes. So when the worms first lay their eggs, it is this bright yellow. So it's not hard to miss. But as it gets closer to hatching, then it gets orangish in color. But not only does it change color, the freshly laid egg has a oval shape to it, or a lemon shape. When the egg gets closer to hatching, it kind of flattens a bit, so it changes the shape, and then it has this orange color. So that way you know that the eggs are close to hatching. So if it is a case where you want to do experiments with your worms, or you want to have eggs that are close to being hatching, you just look for the orange color, and the shape usually changes. It does not get flat, it just changes to a bit flatter, so it loses some of the oval shape. Okay. And for those of you who do not comment on the live, and I can't see who you are, so I'm just saying hi to you and thank you for joining me. Okay, so the next question is it necessary to sift your castings? Closet Hoarder says, should I be concerned if there's worms in the wet cardboard sheet covering? I DIY 3 kitty litter box into a stackable. Interesting, nice. In the bottom, I have shredded leaves. They are in the middle. The third, extra cardboard. No, you should not be concerned. They love the cardboard. I don't know what it is. I don't know if maybe because they feel safe in it, but they love to go in the cardboard if it is damp, and they will lay their cocoons in there. So you shouldn't be worried. The one, they're going to be eating the cardboard. Two, the cardboard is going to retain moisture. And so, and then they are protected when they are in the cardboard. So you don't need to worry about them being in the cardboard. They actually love it in there. Yes. So we were asking the question, is it necessary to sift castings? Yes and no. Why yes? If you want, if you're considering selling your castings, then yes, you want to sift your castings because you want to get out large particles, and you want to get out as much of the food scraps as you can from your castings, and you want to get the worms out of your castings. So yes, it is necessary to sift your castings. If you're concerned about losing worms to your garden when you'd rather to have them in your worm bin, then yes, it is necessary to sift your castings. If however you're not worried about a few worms getting from your worm bin to your garden, then you don't have to worry about sifting unless you want to have that nice refined look of the worm castings. So it all depends on what your end goal is. It's not absolutely necessary that you sift it, but if you want a nicer, richer looking product, then you sift your castings. Or if you're using it for commercial purposes, then you want to sift it. And if you don't want, if you would rather have the worms in your worm bin as opposed to in your garden, then you sift your castings. Okay, let's see the next question. So the next question is, why should you harvest your red wigglers from your outside worm bin in the winter? There are some worms that can stand the cold, but no worm can stand freezing. None of the composting worms, at least, can stand freezing. So it is necessary to take your worms indoors if you're going to experience freezing temperature. If the worms that you have, however, are worms that will are not surface feeders, like the nightcrawlers, these are not surface feeders. They live in the soil. They will die if you don't. Yes, that's right, and why. So they will die if you Europe, the nightcrawlers, they are not surface feeders. So they will live in the soil and they come up to wherever the organic material is to feed. So as the time gets cold and the ground start to freeze, if you have them in your garden, then they will always keep going down, down until they go below the frost line. So for night crawlers, if you have them outdoors where they are in the ground, or in the soil, then it's not bad. If you have them in bin and they're going to experience freezing condition, then you want to put them indoors. The same thing for your red wigglers. These ones absolutely hate the cold. So you have to take them indoors once you have them in a worm bin. Because once the temperature reaches below 10 degrees, they will start to slow down. When the temperature reaches 5 degrees, they're going to start to die. So you have to take them indoors. Is a worm thermometer is a worm thermometer necessary? I'm going to assume that by using the term worm thermometer, you're talking about a thermometer that can measure pH. Oh, hi, Pit Stop. How are you? I so enjoyed that video you did today showing your tour of that greenhouse with the with all those tropical plants. I was just there looking at the bananas and the mango trees, and I'm like, oh yeah, this feels like home. Right. So let's see. So yes, you take your worms indoors because they cannot survive the freezing temperature. So it is best for you to put them indoors where they have a certain amount of warmth. Oh yes. So Closet Hoarder asked about worm thermometer. So I'm assuming that you're talking about those thermometers that measure pH. It measures moisture and light. So it's not necessary. You don't have to have a thermometer for your worms. You can get it if you want. I have one, and to be honest with you, I've had it for about a year, and I've maybe used it twice. It's not really necessary because you're welcome, Pit Stop. It's not really necessary, and the reason is you can do without it. If you're concerned about the acidity in your bin, usually if your bin is acidic any at all, it will smell sour. So if you smell your bin sour, then you know your bin is acidic. For the moisture in your bin, you can test it with your hand. So you take a handful of the material that is in your bin, preferably from the lower portion of your bin because that is where most of the moisture is going to be. You give it a gentle squeeze. You don't want to squeeze it too hard because if you have worms in there, then you could be crushing them. So you want to give it a gentle squeeze. You should see 1 or 2 drops of water coming out, and that would mean that you have sufficient moisture in your bin. If water is going to flow out of your hand when you squeeze it, it means that you have way too much moisture in your bin. At this point in time, you can either turn a fan on the worm bin to dry it out, or you can maybe pour out the content of your bin and spread it out for the quick fix, or you can put shredded paper in the bin and mix it in, or put it on the bottom of the bin because it's more likely to dry it out then. So yes, so just get a handful of the material, squeeze it. If you see a few drops, no, it's actually a thermometer. You mean to measure the temperature of your bin? Yeah. If you live in an environment where it is hot, like it gets really hot, then it might be a good idea to have a thermometer, because then you can test the temperature, especially if you see worms crawling out, to know if that is why they are leaving. But yes, so if you live in areas where it is too hot, if it is too cold, you don't necessarily need a thermometer. Because, and the reason you don't necessarily need a thermometer for to test the cold is because you know what the weather is in your environment. Whatever you're feeling, if you feel chilled, chances are your worms will be chilled as well. If you're cold, chances are your worm will be cold. So the only difference is, if the worms are in a container with a lot of contents, where the content is producing heat, then that's different. But if it's a container that doesn't really have a lot of content in it, then chances are your worms will be cold, because whatever temperature it is outside, your worm bin will be 2 degrees cooler than whatever the temperature is outdoors. Right. So you don't necessarily need to have a thermometer unless it is very hot in your region and you need to know if it is too hot for your worms. But most people don't really use it, as far as I know. At least most of the worm farmers that I know don't really use these things. Most of the time when people use these devices are, oh, hi, gardening, Buchanan, or bar chucking, because I'm so familiar with Buchanan. Every time I see your name, I say Buchanan, bar chucking. Sorry. Yes, I'm glad you were able to stop by. Right, so most of the time, people who use these thermometers and stuff like that are people who do worm farming on a commercial level. And so if they are indoors, especially, then they will have they try to control the conditions that is inside of their worm farm. But yeah, you don't necessarily need it. I hope that was able to answer your question. Now here is a question: have any of you who do worm farming ever actually seen the eggs hatching? I waited years. Well, I'm talking as if I've been worm farming for decades. I'm using shredded leaves, torn cardboard, and unfinished compost as bedding. Is manure, soil, or cocoa coir really necessary? There is no hard and fast rule as to what you can use for your bedding. In fact, some of my bins, I don't have anything extra in there as bedding. Um, I feed my worm finished compost. That is their bedding. That is their food scrap. That is their food. So occasionally I might feel like putting some shredded paper in there, but I don't have any other bedding in there. So there's no hard and fast rule as to what you must use for bedding. If leaves are what you have, leaves are what you use. If paper, shredded paper or cardboard is what you have, you use that. If you have manure, you use that. So it depends on what is available to you. It depends on what you want to use. It depends on also what is affordable, because why go and buy something expensive if you can find some alternative that you don't have to pay for? So it's just a matter of, as long as it is good for bedding, if that's what you have, that's what you go with. I know for me, the coconut curry is not a choice. I don't have that here. Let's see. Russell says, just put in a pound of euros on the table under the light to get accurate weight. Then in new bedding, feed. for 3 weeks until it's time to harvest more cocoon or pro castings. Okay, so you're using the light method to harvest them. Okay, nice. Well, how do you harvest your cocoon, Russell? Do you unpick them or do you have a device that separate them? Because um when I just started harvesting the worms, I wanted to separate the cocoons, and I was told that you could use the 1/4 inch hardware cloth. But I find that with the red wiggler eggs, they are so small that they just fall through, so it doesn't work. So I know a friend of mine, the lady I bought the worms from, a friend of hers made a sifter for her, and the holes were oval in shape, 1/8 holes, but they were oval in shape. So because of that, the worm eggs could not fall through. So she's able to harvest her cocoons that way. But the 1/8 cloth does not work for harvesting cocoons. So how do you harvest your cocoons? And then I tried to look online to see if I could find devices that you could use to harvest them. And man, they have some commercial products that they are just developing, and the price is ridiculous. And why it says, uh, I handpicked the cocoons I sent to you. Okay. And Barchakin says, I had to pick the cocoons out of the castings I sifted. Yes, that is the method I'm using. It is so tedious, especially if you want a lot. I use 1/4 inch hardware cloth. Okay. Yeah. I use the 1/8 hardware cloth for if I'm sifting compost, then I use the 1/4 inch, and then if I'm sifting castings, I use the 1/8. Double screening and hand pick the small ones. Okay, that works. Yes, it was. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I could come up. And it is so hard to find material that will allow the castings to go through and let the eggs remain. Because I've been searching all over for material like that to make a sifter for just for the eggs, but it's hard to find. So I don't know. 1/4 inch and 1/8. Okay. Yes, I don't know. Um, one of the devices I saw, it was, it has an electric motor, and then it has a sensor on it that senses whenever there is a worm cocoon in the mix, and then it separates it out. But I don't see why those things have to be so expensive. And if I was selling cocoons, then maybe I would consider getting it, but I'm not selling cocoons, so it's not worth the expense. Yes, I was asking if any of you have ever seen any of these eggs as they hatch. Bar Chucking says, I have seen a few videos making a cylinder sifter out of PVC pipes, 5 gallon bucket, and hardware cloth. Yes, I've seen some of those videos as well. My sifter, when I'm sifting a lot of castings, I have a sifter that I made from bicycle wheel, the rim of the wheel, but I don't like it because I think I used the wrong size. I probably need to use a smaller rim because the rim I have is about 2 feet wide, the diameter. So it's a bit big, and then I'm thinking of making it smaller. So the rim of the wheels, the rim of the sifter, I have casters or little wheels that the sifter, the bicycle rim spins on. So I have rim at one end, the hardware cloth around it, and rim at the other end. And the problem I have with it so far is that the distance between the two rims are too short, is too short. So the material falls out before it finished sifting, so I have to re-sift it again. So I'm going to be modifying that next year. But it is so hard to find the smaller bicycle wheels so that I can use. Because originally you could always go to the city dump and take stuff from there, but then you know how people are. Even when they're getting things for free, they're complaining, and some of them will talk about lawsuit, even though they are the ones who go and take the material. So someone went and took, or a few people went and took things from the city dump, and then when things go wrong, they try to sue the city. So now the city make it where you cannot go to the dump and get anything. So those tiny bicycle rims I can't get access to. But I'm going to be modifying my sifter next year. I want it to be longer. And I'm thinking of maybe I'm going to be motorizing it, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do that next year. But I want to have it twice the length of what it is now, with the first layer of it being 1/4 inch hardware cloth, and then the second portion being 1/8 hardware cloth. I am nodding as you talk. Okay, me too. Okay. I am still new to worm farming. I'm starting small, less than 100 worms, and scared of acidity due to feeding. Is the bedding sufficient? Is the bedding sufficient for feeding in the beginning? How much can I introduce vegetation? Okay, okay, so you have less than 100 worms. You have a rough idea of their body mass. Whatever their body mass is, half of that for the day. So, yes, you can use just the bedding as their food scraps, but if your bedding is crushed paper and cardboard and stuff like that, although they will eat it, that is just all carbons. There are no greens in it. So you want to introduce them to the food scraps as well, and they tend to love the food scraps. So give them a combination of the food scraps and the bedding. You don't have to worry about the amount of bedding that you have in there, but you do have to be concerned about the amount of food scraps. So whatever the body mass of all your worms combined, give them half of that amount in vegetation. Watch them to see whether or not they finish that amount in a day. If they don't finish it in a day, it means that they're eating less than half their body weight in a day. So you're going to feed them less. If they eat more than that, if they eat that within before even a day is up, then it means that they're eating more than their body weight in a day. So you want to increase the amount that you're feeding them to whatever their body mass is. You give them that amount of food. So just observe them and see how much they eat. So I would say for the first couple of weeks, you just monitor them, see the rate at which they eat, and feed them accordingly. Now, it can be tedious if you're busy to be feeding them daily. So you can feed them once or twice per week. So you know that, say, you have 100 worms and maybe they would eat X amount of food for today. Multiply that amount of X by the amount of days that you're going to wait before you feed them again, and feed them that once for that period of time. I hope I'm not confusing you. Right. Yeah. So, say you were going to give them a ounce of feeding today, and you know that you're busy, you don't have time to go and feed them every day. So, if you were going to give them a ounce of feeding today, and you decide, okay, I'm going to feed them every 5 days, then multiply 5 by the amount of ounce, by the 1 ounce, and then you feed them that amount. 5 days later, you go back and feed them again. Do the 1/4 inch first, and Sorry, do the eighth inch first and the quarter after. Yes, as I was saying that, I was thinking that doesn't sound right, because you want to get out the castings first. You want the finer, neater product first, and separating the whatever worms might be in it, and then the quarter inch will handle the bigger stuff that you're going to be throwing back anyway to feed the worms. Yes, so you got that right. Thanks for the correction. I have one of those PVC and 5-gallon bucket ones. It is great for inside during winter. I use it to shred bedding. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, there's no reason why those shouldn't work. And I like the fact that they're not heavy, although I don't have one. But yeah, using PVC, they should be so easy to move around, especially if you don't make them too big. And then, do you have the PVC ones that you can actually fold up, or do you have those that once you build it just stay that way? 100 worms equal a quarter cup of vegetation per week. Um, that is not really what I am saying. I'm not saying that 100 worms equal a quarter cup. If your 100 worms, if you put your 100 worms in a cup, and the 100 worms is half cup, then yes, feed them quarter. No, that's not right. If your 100 worms is half, when you put them in a cup, you have half a cup. That quarter cup of vegetation would be for one day, because whatever the volume of worms that you have, half of that, of course, the vegetation and the worms might not weigh the same amount. But so I'm saying, if you have 100 worms and they say they're half cup of worms, half cup of vegetation might not have the same weight as half cup of worms. But I'm saying, whatever the weight of your worms, they are going to eat half of that in their body weight, up to half of that in their body weight. So whatever the weight of your worms, multiply half of that by the amount of days that it's going to take you to feed them. I hope we get what I'm saying. So let's say your worms weigh 100 grams. This is just for argument's sake. So let's say your worms weigh 100 grams. It means that you're going to feed them 50 grams for the day. If you see that they're eating 50 grams in a day, then yes, you know that, okay, you can continue feeding them 50 grams a day. If they're eating less than 50 grams, then you don't want to be feeding them 50 grams in a day, because they're not going to be able to eat it. However, if you don't have enough time to feed them, and you know that they're eating 50 grams in a day, say you're going to feed them once, and that food scraps is supposed to last them for 5 days. You're going to say 50 grams times 5. So you're going to have 250 grams that you're going to feed them. And so say today is Monday, you feed them today, Monday, 250 grams. 5 days later, which is Saturday, then they should be finished with the food by the end, with that 250 grams by the end of Saturday. So Sunday, you're going to feed them another 250 grams. So what I'm saying is, whatever the weight of your worms, half their body weight times however long it's going to take for you to feed them again. That is how you feed them. A little 4 by 6 foot tarp on the floor. Oh, okay. Okay. Now, how long does it take for hatchlings to get their pigmentation? Worms, the red wigglers, when they're born, they are white. They're not pink, they're not red. They are white. So it takes red wigglers 8 hours before they actually gain their pigmentation. Um, I am not sure about the nightcrawlers in terms of pigmentation. Are they born with their pigmentation or are they white? If you have ever seen any of your nightcrawler hatchlings, like shortly after they have hatched, can you answer that question for me? Whether or not they are pink or do they born white and then gain their pigmentation after? So it doesn't matter if you know how long it takes for them to gain their pigmentation, but I would just like to know if when they hatch, if they have their pigmentation already or if they're white. So if any of you can answer that question for me, I'd be very happy. They're pink. Okay, thank you, and white. Do they get darker afterwards? Or lighter or remain the same? Light pink? Okay. So in the born, they're light pink. Is that what you're saying, and white? They're light pink. So do they change? Do they get darker afterwards? Or is that the color they maintain? Well, the hatchings that I have, no, they're not light pink. So I guess they get darker. Okay. All right. Thank you for that reply. So here's an interesting question, at least it's interesting to me. Worm cocoons can survive freezing temperatures up to 3 years. If they can survive freezing, can they survive extreme heat? The cocoons, that is. What do you think? Well, interestingly enough, they actually cannot survive extreme heat. So the cocoons, they can survive the freezing, but if the temperature gets too extreme, then they will die. 3 years, worm cocoons can freeze and thaw and survive the freezing, and the cocoons can last up to 3 years before it actually hatch. And how quickly the cocoons hatch? After the first 3 weeks, because it takes, if all the conditions are met, it takes 3 weeks for the cocoon to hatch. So if condition is not right, the worm eggs can last 3 years before it hatches. Yes, you're right and white. The cocoons will indeed die. So they can survive freezing, but they can't survive extreme heat. So if you are storing cocoons, then you want to make sure that they have a fairly cool or warm environment, but not hot. And so now the final question for today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to answer. But in the meantime, this is the final question that I have for you. How many cocoons can a mature red wriggler produce in a week? And notice I said red wigglers, and this is because I don't know the answer for that question regarding the other worms, but the mature red wriggler can lay up to 3 cocoons in a week. So think about that. You have one worm, 3 cocoons. Each cocoons can have up to 20 eggs. But the thing about it is that although each cocoon can have 20 eggs, it is only an average of 2 to 4 worms that come out of the cocoon. Sometimes it can be more, so as I said, average. So sometimes it can be more, but it's not a lot that does come out. I've heard of instances where someone observed 6 of them coming out of the cocoon. So it can be more, it can be less, but an average of 6 will So this is how you can calculate. This is how you can calculate how much worms you can actually get from your worms. Because if you have one worm laying 3 cocoons, and say, for example, you get 3 hatchlings from each cocoon, so you're talking about 9 hatchlings in 1 week from one worm. Interesting, isn't it? Yes. Okay, so that is all the questions that I have for you. I guess there are no more questions. So I'm going to thank you all for joining me on this live. You can join me on Monday again when I will be discussing some gardening questions, or on Friday when I'll be discussing some worm farming questions. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe, turn on your notification, and take care. You too, Tina, have yourself a wonderful weekend. In fact, all of you have yourself a wonderful weekend. And be good now. You're welcome, Rodney. Oh, and Rodney, I hope to learn more about your worm farm, how it is going for you. Are you going to be doing videos on that? I don't know if you do videos. I don't think so. But every now and then you can let me know how the worm farm is going for you. And if you have any questions, of course, you can feel free to send me a message and I'll gladly answer it for you. So anyway, take care, everyone. Stay safe.